A photograph that should not be. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a photograph exists that simply shouldn't, captured in 1912. It documents a Fugate clan family reunion, 43 people clustered around a worn farmhouse. Their faces bear an impossible hue of blue, not from paint, not from bruises, but born blue. Their skin held the shade of a winter sky, their lips darker than midnight. The photographer's hand shook as he documented what local residents had whispered about for generations but never dared to capture. This wasn't a sudden, fleeting medical anomaly, it was the product of something far more deliberate, far more unsettling. 3 centuries of bloodlines had twisted back on themselves, like a serpent consuming its own tail. For 300 years, cousins married cousins, brothers took sisters as wives. A family tree had grown, not outward toward light, but inward into a darkness so complete that nature itself seemed to revolt. The Fugate family of Troublesome Creek didn't merely live in isolation, they were isolation, cut off not by mountains or rivers, but by decisions made generation after generation in the shadow of shame. What started as necessity became obsession. What began as mere survival challenged the very foundations of human genetics. Tonight, we journey into the hollow where the blue people lived. We will trace the bloodline that became so tangled it engineered its own medical impossibility, walking through graveyards where headstones recount marriages that were never meant to be. They tell of children born carrying the weight of their ancestors' sins in their very blood. This is the story of America's most inbred family. It's a tale so disturbing that, even now, nearly a century after that picture was taken, the mountain people speak of the Fugates only in hushed tones. Some secrets are buried in the earth, others are carried in the blood, passed down like a curse that strengthens with each generation. The blue skin was only the beginning. What we have uncovered about the Fugate family tree will force you to question everything you thought you knew about the hidden recesses of American history. Welcome to the hollow where nature's laws were broken, and the price was paid in blue blood. The perfect genetic storm. The story's genesis is 1820, when Martin Fugate arrived in the remote hills of eastern Kentucky. He carried a secret encoded in his very DNA, a recessive gene that lay dormant, simply waiting. Martin himself wasn't blue, he appeared healthy, normal, a typical frontiersman seeking land where no questions would be asked. But the blood in his veins carried the blueprint for something that would haunt his descendants for generations. Martin married Elizabeth Smith, a woman whose pale skin concealed the same genetic time bomb. Neither one knew what they carried, neither grasped that their union would birth not just children, but a medical mystery that would bewilder doctors for over a century. Their first child, Zachariah, emerged from the womb with skin the color of a bruise. The midwife nearly dropped him, crossing herself and whispering prayers to ward off demons. But Zachariah lived, and as years passed, more blue children followed. The community, already wary of outsiders, began to whisper. Some called it divine punishment, others believed the family had allied themselves with darker forces. The reality was both simpler and more terrifying. Martin and Elizabeth had unknowingly created the perfect genetic storm. In the isolation of Troublesome Creek, where the nearest neighbor was miles away and the outside world felt like another planet, the Fugate family faced a decision. They could scatter, moving to distant towns where their blue children might find spouses with different blood. Or, they could stay and turn inward, marrying within the clan to keep their secret contained. They chose secrecy. They chose isolation. They chose each other. By 1850, the pattern was set. Fugate cousins married Fugate cousins. The gene pool, already shallow, became a mere puddle. With every generation, the blue became deeper, more pronounced. Children were born with skin so dark they seemed otherworldly. The family cemetery quickly filled with small headstones, many marking lives cut short by complications that modern medicine would later trace to severe inbreeding. The mountain people learned to steer clear of the Fugate hollow after sunset. They spoke of strange sounds echoing through the trees, of blue figures moving like shadows among the ghosts. What they didn't know was that the Fugates were creating something unprecedented in American history, a family so genetically isolated they were evolving backward, becoming less human with each passing generation. The twisted family tree. By 1880, the Fugate family tree was something no botanist would recognize. Branches that should have grown apart had twisted together, creating knots that defied nature's design. Zachariah Fugate, the first blue child, married his own cousin. Their children, in turn, married each other. Aunts became wives. Uncles became fathers-in-law. The boundary between relative and spouse was blurred beyond recognition. The records that have survived from this period are a genealogist's nightmare. Birth certificates list fathers who were simultaneously grandfathers, and mothers who were both sisters and wives. The courthouse clerk in Hazard, Kentucky, started requiring double documentation for Fugate marriages, simply unable to believe that families could become so entangled. One marriage license from 1883 shows the bride and groom shared not just the same last name, but the same 4 grandparents. Luna Fugate, born in 1888, represented the pinnacle of this genetic concentration. Her parents were double first cousins, their fathers were brothers, and their mothers were sisters. Luna's skin was so blue it looked purple in certain light. But her appearance wasn't the only thing that set her apart. Luna never learned to speak correctly, communicating mainly through grunts and gestures. Her spine curved unnaturally, forcing her to walk hunched over, like something emerging from a cave. She lived to be 91, a walking testament to the consequences of human bloodlines becoming too pure. The family developed a sort of language of their own, a mix of broken English and sounds that seemed to bypass human vocal cords entirely. They understood each other perfectly, but outsiders found their speech nearly incomprehensible. It was as if they were becoming their own species, adapted to the darkness of their hollow and the suffocating closeness of their shared blood. Children born to the Fugates during this era faced challenges far beyond just their blue skin. Heart defects were common. Mental disabilities ran through the family like a river. Many died in infancy, their tiny bodies unable to sustain life with blood so concentrated, so lacking in genetic diversity. The family cemetery expanded yearly, filled with small graves marking not only individual deaths but the slow death of human genetic potential. Yet, they continued. They continued to marry within the clan. The outside world had completely ceased to exist for them. They had become prisoners of their own blood, trapped in a reproductive cycle that grew more perilous with each generation. The price of purity. The turn of the 20th century brought no respite to the Fugate bloodline. If anything, the isolation deepened. By 1900, there were over 200 blue-skinned Fugates scattered across the hollows of eastern Kentucky, but their world had shrunk to the size of a few mountain ridges. They had created their own ecosystem of genetic horror, where normal human reproduction was biologically impossible. Dr. Madison Cohane would later document his findings when he first encountered the Fugates in 1960. His medical notes, preserved in the University of Kentucky archives, read like passages from a horror novel: children with 11 fingers, adults whose hearts beat erratically because the muscle had developed abnormally in the womb, women who gave birth to infants that lived only hours, their bodies too damaged by genetic repetition to sustain life. But perhaps most unsettling was the family's psychological state. They moved differently than normal humans, slower, more deliberately, as if their thoughts had to navigate through thick blood to reach their limbs. They rarely made eye contact, even with one another. When they did speak, which was seldom, their voices carried a flat, emotionless quality suggesting something fundamental had been lost in their genetic compression. The family had developed rituals around death that revealed how completely normalized genetic failure had become. When babies were born with severe deformities, they were not mourned in the traditional sense. Instead, the family would gather in silent acceptance, as if such tragedies were as natural as the changing seasons. They had learned to expect the worst from their own blood, and their blood rarely disappointed. Local doctors started to refuse treatment to the Fugates after 1905, when Dr. Samuel Morrison examined a newborn and documented characteristics he had never seen in medical literature. The infant's blood was so thick with concentrated genetics that it moved sluggishly through tiny veins. Morrison burned his notes and never spoke of the examination again, but his assistant later revealed that the doctor suffered nightmares for months afterward. The Fugates had reached a stage where they were no longer quite human, but they were not dead either. They existed in a liminal space, sustained by genetics so inbred that they had engineered their own biological category. They were living proof that some boundaries should never be crossed, some genetic lines never blurred beyond recognition. The culmination. By 1950, the Fugate family had become something that should not exist in nature. 5 generations of continuous inbreeding had generated biological impossibilities, children born with organs on the wrong side of their bodies, adults whose bones grew at impossible angles, creating limbs that functioned but looked like they belonged to a different species entirely. The blue skin, once their most defining feature, was now the least disturbing aspect of their genetic reality. Benjamin Fugate, born in 1943, represented the culmination of this genetic experiment gone wrong. His parents were siblings. His grandparents were cousins who were also aunt and nephew. His family tree was less a tree and more a telephone pole, straight up and down, with no outward branches. Benjamin's blood was so genetically concentrated that when he cut himself, the wound would barely bleed. His circulation had slowed to the point where his heart beat only 40 times per minute. Yet, he somehow lived to be 67. The family had developed their own medical practices, passed down through generations of genetic disasters. They knew which herbs could alleviate the breathing problems that plagued most blue children. They understood how to set bones that grew crooked from birth. They had learned to deliver babies that might survive despite carrying the accumulated genetic damage of centuries. They had become experts in managing their own biological breakdown. But perhaps most haunting was how utterly normal this all seemed to them. When children were born with severe disabilities, the family displayed no surprise, no grief. They had accepted that their bloodline produced monsters, and they continued breeding nonetheless. They had chosen genetic purity over genetic health. And by 1950, that choice had created a family existing outside the normal boundaries of human biology. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this were your bloodline? Would you have broken the cycle? Or would the weight of tradition have trapped you, too? The answer matters more than you might imagine. Because by the 1950s, the Fugates were not just a medical curiosity, they had become a warning about the consequences of human beings prioritizing blood purity above all else. They were living proof that some genetic experiments should never be performed, some family traditions never continued. The legacy of extinction. The beginning of the end arrived in 1960 when Dr. Madison Cowan journeyed to the eastern Kentucky hills on a mission that would expose the Fugate family to the outside world for the first time in over a century. Cowan had heard the rumors of the Blue People, tales passed down through generations of mountain folk who claimed to have seen families with skin the color of midnight. Most doctors dismissed these stories as mere folklore. But Cowan was different. He believed that somewhere in those mountains lay the answers to genetic questions that mainstream medicine was too afraid to ask. What he found shattered everything he thought he knew about human genetics. In a remote hollow near Troublesome Creek, he discovered not just 1 or 2 blue individuals, but an entire family system that had turned inbreeding into an art form. The Fugates didn't simply marry cousins, they had created a closed genetic loop where every member of the family was related to every other member in multiple ways simultaneously. Cowan's documentation revealed the true extent of the genetic damage. He found families where the average IQ had dropped below 70. Children were born with hearts that had only 3 chambers instead of 4. Adults whose skeletal systems had developed so abnormally they couldn't stand upright. The blue skin, he realized, was only the visible manifestation of a genetic destruction that ran far deeper than appearance. But most disturbing to Cowan was the family's reaction to his presence. They were not ashamed of their condition, they were proud of it. They spoke of their blue skin as a mark of purity, a sign that their bloodline had not been contaminated by outsiders. They had convinced themselves that their genetic isolation made them superior, even as their bodies offered proof of the opposite with each generation. The doctor's notes, sealed for decades due to their disturbing content, revealed a family that had crossed a line from which there was no return. By 1960, the Fugates possessed DNA so concentrated, so repeatedly folded back on itself, that they had essentially created their own subspecies. They were the ultimate result of what happens when human beings reject genetic diversity in favor of genetic purity. The result was a family that barely qualified as human anymore. Cowan left the mountains forever changed. His final report, submitted to a medical journal but never published, contained a warning that reads like prophecy: "What I found in those hills represents not just a medical anomaly, but a glimpse into humanity's darkest genetic possibilities." The unresting ghost. Today, the last of the visible blue Fugates are gone. Benjamin Fugate died in 2009, taking with him the final visible reminder of what 3 centuries of inbreeding could create. But the story doesn't end with his death. It echoes through the mountains of Kentucky like a ghost that refuses to rest. The hollow where the blue people lived still stands empty, their abandoned houses slowly being reclaimed by the forest, as if nature itself is attempting to erase the evidence of what occurred there. The genetic legacy of the Fugates extends far beyond their blue skin. Modern genealogical research has shown that their bloodline, concentrated through centuries of intermarriage, created genetic markers that appear nowhere else in human history. They had become a closed genetic experiment, a family that evolved in isolation until they were no longer entirely human. Scientists who study their preserved DNA samples speak in hushed tones about their discoveries, genetic combinations so impossible they challenge our very understanding of human reproduction. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Fugate story is how easily it could happen again. In our modern era of genetic testing and medical awareness, we tell ourselves that such extreme inbreeding is impossible. Yet, isolated communities still exist. Religious groups that marry only within their faith. Families that prioritize bloodline purity above genetic health. The Fugates were not an anomaly, they were a warning about what happens when human beings choose genetic isolation over genetic diversity. The mountain people claim that on certain nights, when the fog drifts through Troublesome Creek, you can still see blue figures moving through the trees, ghosts of a family that pushed human genetics beyond its breaking point, spirits of children who were born carrying the weight of their ancestors' choices in their very blood. The locals still won't go near the old Fugate homestead after dark, claiming that the land itself remembers what was done there. The Fugates created something that science is still struggling to comprehend, a family so genetically concentrated that they existed at the very edge of human possibility. They were the final result of what happens when blood purity becomes more important than genetic health, when family tradition matters more than the welfare of future generations. They were America's most inbred family, and their legacy serves as a warning that echoes through time. Some secrets should stay buried. Some genetic lines should be allowed to end. The blue people of Kentucky proved that there are boundaries in human genetics that should never be crossed, consequences that last for generations, and prices that are paid not only by those who make the choices but by every child born into their bloodline. Their story concludes not with redemption, but with extinction.